Welcome to all of you. So, this is the first week, first lecture on the course Scheduling Techniques in Projects. So, the first course is primarily introduction to what is scheduling. So, as we will see in this particular class, there are 4 topics which I will be covering here. First is what is project, what is construction projects, project management, and what are the 3 main themes in the project management, which is very critical for any project, for success of any project. I would say planning, scheduling and control. In there we are going to only focus on a very small topic which is only on scheduling and how to apply the different available scheduling techniques, under what situations we have to apply. So, that is what we are going to learn in this entire course. Since the scope is focused on scheduling, so we will also be seeing on an overview on what is scheduling, what are the different types of scheduling availability and so on, and then work breakdown structure. So, with that we will finish for today's class. So, now what is a project? Some of these things may be little boring for you because this is like a basic backbone of any construction management student, but still I thought I will just freshen up and then so that you will have a little idea on and you will come to a same common platform. So, what is a project? So, a project, there are so many definitions all over the place, and if you look at the famous PMBOK definition on project, it has a collective several stages. One unique words which I would like to underline here are every project is unique. Okay. For example, manufacturing a stapler. So, 1000 staplers if you are manufacturing, that is not called as a project, but the initial arrangement in which you are trying to figure out and then do primarily in how to get out a stapler, we can call it as a project. So, every project is primarily unique in that it requires doing something different from what was done previously. A project must have a specified objective to be completed with certain specifications. So, what is it I wanted to do? Maybe I want to build a house. Okay, that is a specific objective I have there, and certain specifications also I want. I want a very lavish bungalow setup, or I want a very simple home and with minimum cost into it. So, there is some specifications or guidelines into how I want to achieve my objective, and there should be a specific start and a specific end date for the whole project. Maybe I want to start the house construction maybe in the next 1 month or so, and I would like to finish it in 6 months. There may be a specific plan in everyone's mind when you want to perceive any project, and it should also consume resources. Resources can be in multiple forms: manpower, materials, machinery, money also can sometimes be a major resource component when you are working on a project. Now, if you look at the projects, so what can be called as a projects? Projects can have a varied range. It can range from simple repair works or a medium type of works taken up by most public private sector properties, or the complex infrastructure construction projects like your roadways, railways, airways you can take. So, all these can be called as a project. So, whatever is you want to classify, it should have the above defined objectives, then they are all called as a projects. We may also have urgent projects, secret mission projects. So, the way we operate all these projects will vary from one to another, but everything can be called as a project. Now, what is construction specific? Let us go little into construction. So far I gave a very broad definition. Now, we will see what is construction. There are some typical characteristic features of any construction industry. For example, it is the largest industry in the world, that nobody can deny. We are the largest employers in manpower compared to any other sector next to agriculture. Most projects exhibit time delays, cost overruns or conflicts among stakeholders. Every time no difference of opinion, or maybe they have understood the project in a different way. So, there are some conflicts at each and any stage of the project with primarily with the stakeholders, and most of the projects are always boiled with uncertainty, complexity, because many of the reasons can be narrowed down to lack of clear understanding in what the client requirements are. Okay, apart from the real complex nature of the project itself. So, these are the characteristic features of any construction industry you can talk about. Apart from, there are other issues like environment situations, then unskilled laborers in the industry. All these enhance the complexity and the problems which we face in construction industry. Now, how does a construction project start? So, the construction project generally starts with a project owner's desire to do or perform something. It can be create an, for example, if it is a government project, it can be even create something like an airport project or something. For if it is a private party, it can be set up in an apartment projects. So, it can vary from people to people, but there is primarily a desire to do something. Okay? And success of the project lies in how best the typical two parties apart from the client or your designer and the contractor, and how they have understood or perceived completely the owner's desire and they have implemented in their own design or in construction. There lies the complete success. So, if you look at project management in construction industry, or what we call it as a construction project management, it is primarily a professional practice of planning, scheduling and controlling a finite number of resources to achieve a set of goals. So, very simple a definition we have, but when you start working on a project, you will understand this is really complex when in a construction environment. So, with this background, now we will see where we are right now. Let us just give a glimpse on why is it so complex right now. Okay. So, project management in the past 50-60 years and the project management done recently in the last 10 years maybe, if you want to look at. So, I just wanted to just list out what all the projects has happened, construction projects has happened. If you look at the traditional project, I have given a name called traditional and modern. It does not mean the management techniques were traditional and modern. It only, I wanted to say the timeline with which these projects have happened. Okay. So, if you look at few examples, maybe India Gate, Qutub Minar, I am just taking examples in and around Delhi only. India Gate, Qutub Minar, Red Fort, Lotus Temple, Rashtrapati Bhavan. So, you can see so many examples which had happened in the last 50 years back. Okay. The current projects, if you look at Akshardham Temple, Delhi Indira Gandhi International Airport, Delhi Metro, Yamuna Expressway, very successful projects I can list out on the other extreme also. So, how was the project management differ in those days compared to now? In those days, there was a rigid environment. They took so many years for completion. Maybe they didn't even have a proper mechanism to look at time overruns, cost overruns, impact of all these onto the projects. There was one deciding authority and the entire team had gone ahead in the same way. Now we have many challenging environment. If you want to, even the owner starts asking, okay, how much, why are you delaying the project? I want the project in 1 year. Okay. So, now the knowledge is like spread across the whole community, and so the environment is very challenging and everybody wants to build something unique compared to others and they wanted to be in the name fame. So, all these have created the challenge in the environment. So, there is a changing trend set now, and owners also want more and more in these days. Okay. In the earlier days, people always had worked in silos. So, which implies somebody has told me what I have to do. So, I am only very focused with that alone. I am not worried about what X, Y or Z in my team are doing at all in the project. Okay. But right now people are very curious in knowing what others are doing, so that they can also share ideas, share their tasks, or they can get some inputs from them. They can also share their outputs to others. So, there is an integrated project delivery sort of an environment which is still existing in these days, I would say. Okay. So, the one advantage I would call in the traditional project management methods are the entire team was sitting in one place close to the project site or in and around in the project site till the project was completely done, okay, which is primarily we call as co-location. But right now the entire team is, most of the projects you will see this is a common scenario, they are spread across the entire globe. Okay. And they primarily try to operate using clouds, share their models using clouds, or they send through emails, whatever mechanism. So, primarily the face to face communication, the real constraints which are faced by the people are not really understood by the team, and there is a lot of issues in there. Okay. But that is how the today's environment has to go, because with the technology fast in pace, people do not have the time to travel to one place to another, sit there and do nothing other than focus on the particular project, because they want to do multiple projects at one time. So, and the list goes on, and but just comparing on what happened 50 years, they were also successful projects in those days, and why still project management is really getting into very challenging mode. Okay. I just thought I will just put down all these points. So, primarily this is what is the current scenario right now. Okay. The owners want more and more. The scheduling techniques available 50, 60 years back were not enough at all right now. So, we wanted more techniques, more solutions, more challenges, more innovations. So, obviously, we have to keep the project management to the latest trend as with the market. Okay. So, let us start looking in. As I told you, the scope of this entire course is towards scheduling. So, let us move more on into the scheduling part. Okay. With the last few slides, you would have understood the planning, scheduling, control are the three, like I would say, the triangle of any construction projects. So, this is a PMBOK 5 process groups. It is a very simple diagram. I thought I will just showcase this and for me to continue with my theme. First you have a initiating process, and then there is a planning process, then execution and control. If you see here, planning, execution, control itself is a cyclic process, and the execution control is also a cyclic process. You would see that there is a double arrow mark for the same, and then there is a closing process. Okay. So, this primarily emerged from the PDCA cycle on cyclic improvements and innovation. So, that is the main idea behind this. So, planning process, it is like it is dominant all through even till control phases. Planning is like a first step, and it is a continuous step which runs all along the construction till execution and stops. Okay. Then next comes execution. Execution primarily involves all facets of your construction management, starting from time management, cost management, then you have contract management, safety management, quality management, human resource management, communication management. It has so many issues to coordinate in the execution process, and the control processes are primarily in terms of how best you can manage your time or cost and bring it back to control, suppose if it has slipped beyond your control or something. So, that is primarily your control aspects. Okay. So, as I have explained here, so scheduling is one aspect of the execution process, which we will see little more in detail. So, now moving on into little idea on what is planning, scheduling and control. Obviously, all three has to go together, but we are only going to focus on scheduling, but little idea on what is plan and scheduling is essential for us to move ahead. So, what is planning? I have drawn a small cartoon over the top. So, primarily it is a mental map with which a person has in his mind. So, which is like, if I have to do this, so everybody, even if you want to go out for a party, you think about, okay, what to do, what dress to wear, when should I start, at what time should I go there, what is the mode of transport for me. So, there is sort of a mental map everybody has in their mind, and you will see this in day-to-day activities in your life. Okay. So, planning is generally an activity of the mind, and planning, that is a definition given, it is a creative and demanding mental activity of working out what has to be done, how, when, by whom and with what resources. So, primarily it is doing the job in mind. You do so many iterations. In some literature, people also say it is a mental iteration, okay, which is not shared, laid down or drafted out, but the iteration goes on. Okay, is this feasible? Oh, that is not possible because I have to reach in time, I cannot use this. So, that mental mapping is always works on in somebody's mind. That is primarily a planning process. I have brought it out for you. The planning process is of paramount importance in success of construction projects, and there is a statistics that was quoted in the book. One study has showed exceptional planning effort can yield as much as 40% cost savings over a reasonable planning. In the same study, it was also shown poor planning can create as much as 50% of overruns. Okay. So, if you have a proper planning, obviously you are going to see much benefits in the downtime of your execution part, and if you have not done a proper planning, obviously you are going to end up in time, cost, overruns, whatever, you are going to have a failed project in a way. There are many approaches to planning, and each person can follow their own convenient level, but the process as a whole is not very scientific, or it is not even systematic, and as it is practiced in these days. Okay. And exceptional planning also involves lot of documentation on assumptions, analysis made, etc., in order to finally arrive at the identification or list of work activities. Okay. And the plan also comprises of a number of interlinked plans, for example, quality plan, safety plan, human resources plan. You may have so many plans, and sometimes it is better to have interlinked plans for an integrated approach. Okay. So, next, so first we have seen planning, the next is scheduling. It is determination of the timing and sequence of operations in the project and their assembly to give a overall completion time. So, in some people they also use like a formula, they say scheduling equal to planning plus time, but I do not want to put it exactly in a formula mode. So, it is primarily adding duration in order to uncover all your flaws in the plans, in order to have a systematic fare through of your planning process is primarily called scheduling. So, scheduling is fairly systematic and scientific and can also uncover any flaws in your plans, and the project schedule may mean different to different stakeholders, but generally it is used as a tool to manage your time aspects. So, whenever you talk about scheduling, it is only the time management I am going to talk about in this. So, scheduling is truly an output of the planning process, which is generally an art, and it is never done by computers, and it is only done by people. Okay, do not think I have a list of activities, relationships and durations, I am just putting it down to the computers and the computer gives me an output. Scheduling is done. It is never done by computers, and human intervention is always required, and you need to know what is the flow, how is it, have I done a mistake somewhere. So, scheduling is obviously done by a good scheduler. Okay. Next, project control. So, the minute control happens, I am only going to talk about planning your project schedules, scheduling process, and you are controlling the project schedules. I am only going to talk about time management in the planning, scheduling and control. So, when I am talking about time controls, so construction projects rarely go as per the plan, either it goes ahead or generally it goes as per the plan, and sometimes it also goes beyond the time durations. Okay. So, the project control, it is a continuous process which has several steps, and the few steps are measuring the work progress. So, primarily you have to show if I am working on an activity which is taking like 10 days of duration, on the 5th day you want to know how much of the work has been done, progressed, and how much is supposed to be executed, how much has been really executed on ground, what was the reason, what is the root cause for the delay, accelerated work, etc. So, that measurement has to be done first, and then it has to be compared with the baseline schedule or budget if you want both, and then find any deviations. There is no deviations, then fine, you can go ahead with your processes. Suppose if the project has taken too much of a delay, or it has not even started on maybe on 5th day or 6th day, and you are just waiting for something, some approval or some materials to come, and you are just waiting, then you have to analyze what is the reason for the delay, how to uncover those delays, or what is the corrective action you wanted to do. And if you are starting on after 5th day, then how much you can finish in the remaining 5 days, do you want to have more resources, and how do you want to finish it in the 10 days plan. So, all these are primarily a control process. So, control process is nothing but it is not just measuring what has happened and what is to be planned, it also talks about corrective actions, measuring and so on. So, it is a very broad a theme you would say, I would say, on the control. So, project control generally refers to time and cost control only. Other controls are also available like quality, safety, etc., etc., okay, which has to be dealt in a very different manner. Only time cost control is really easy to monitor and execute in the sites. And next is schedule compression. So, whenever if your schedule has slipped, then you may have to use some techniques which is called schedule compression, compress your schedule, or you do fast tracking, time cost trade off and other issues fall in place there. Okay. So, now let us move on into scheduling again. I am just bringing the 5 process groups which I have shown earlier. So, I have planning. In the execution part, I am going to talk only about the scheduling part, and next is the control processes. Okay. So, since I told I am only focuses on scheduling, so we are going to see on how to do the little partial plans on building up a schedule, and then we will stop with the scheduling techniques available. Okay. So, now what are the benefits of scheduling? Why should I do scheduling? Okay. There are so many benefits available, and the list like goes on and on. Let me talk about from a planning point of view. Okay. So, there are several views I have highlighted in different forms. I should know how much of resource has to be assigned in the project, how many resources has to be consumed for activity A, B, C, etc., etc. So, only when I know this, I can always build my schedule. So, primarily this helps you to assess or assign the resource utilization. Anyway, while we are discussing on how to derive at activity durations, we will also see little on the resource combinations, how it is really playing a major role in arriving at your durations. Next is to predict project completion time. Only when you are putting individual activity time durations and then you are having a very large network diagram, then you will really come to know what is the time completion for my project. Is it 1 year, 6 months and so on. That curiosity everybody will have on the project management side. The next, not only on the total project completion time, and somebody really wants to also know what is the individual milestones completion time. Suppose if I want to build a very big lecture hall complex or something, when will the classrooms be ready, when will the auditoriums be ready, when will the labs be ready. So, there are several milestones in the whole project and somebody wants to know when are these milestones can be achieved. Okay. So, individual milestones also you will come to know when will they be achieved. The next, to avoid conflicts or clashes in the work sequence, as we have seen in the scheduling itself, when we are assigning your plans with the time duration, you also try to uncover the flaws or the mistakes you do in your planning process itself. Some unachievable plans, whatever you have, methodologies you have, all get uncovered when you are putting it on in your schedules. So, it can also avoid conflicts, clashes later on. If you do not have a proper scheduling, it may later on prop up when the execution is going on. So, it can also help you to avoid conflicts or clashes. The next important thing is I can also know what is my cash outflow and what is my cash inflow. When all my cash is spent on various activities and when will I get the payment, how much work I can complete till that date so that I can get the payment back. So, I can easily plan or calculate or anticipate my cash outflows and inflows. So, this scheduling document is used for multiple purposes. The next, as we have seen in the control slides, so to monitor and control the project progress, obviously how much has happened and how much has to be happened and where is the gap between the as planned and the as execution. It's primarily it helps you to monitor. To estimate the impact of changes. Suppose a owner in the midway of a execution says suddenly that he does not want X or Y part in the whole project and he wants to be changed something. Then you can also easily come up or arrive at, okay, what is the change because of a small segment modified or a new segment added up in. So, you can estimate the impact on changes on a projects. It also serves as a record in terms of delays in the work. Okay. So, sometimes when the delays are there, is it a owner related delays or contractor related delays, and is it like shared, is it on the critical path, is it on the non-critical path. So, all those it also helps you to record. To settle or verify disputes in case of delays, which is what I said. So, suppose the owner and contractor both have a mutual misunderstanding saying that this is not from their part, the delay has happened and the other party has to take care of all the penalty, then this document on scheduling, the initial scheduling helps in a way to settle all the disputes and verify the case properly. And the list goes on onto the benefits of scheduling. Next, so types of schedules. There are so many types of schedules. Anyway, when we see the duration estimation, we will also have little idea on how the individual activity duration have emerged and also how these names have come in. We will see little more at that time. So, types of schedules, there are broadly 3 types. In the arbitrary basis, what happens is the owner just indicates the project start and end dates. He says the project feasibility time of start will be next after 1 month and the end date will be after 6 months. So, he just arbitrarily indicates. So, the real practical constraints are not at all analyzed in these arbitrary basis because it comes as an urgent mission or it comes as an compulsion or pressure on the person. So, these type of schedules we call as a schedules are derived out of a pressure from the clients. Okay. The next is intuitive basis. So, prepared, again these are all prepared without using any formal scheduling techniques and very effective when the contractor has extensive experience on projects. Suppose if the contractor has worked on a project and he is supposed to work on a similar project in another 5 or 6 years, with his experience, vast experience he had in the previous project, he can always use his intuitive basis in order to fill up the entire schedule. So, those type of schedules we call it as a intuitive basis. The next is scientific basis. Here it is a formal scheduling techniques are used for analysis and for schedules, and the contractor uses methods for scheduling and he executes it. So, fairly a scientific basis, which is what we are going to see right now. And here there are three types of schedules which researchers have identified. There are again many more types, but we are only going to see three. One is logic driven schedule, the other one is resource driven schedule, and the third one is information driven schedule. So, what is a logic driven schedule? As the name implies, the logic of the construction derives the schedule. For example, after foundation, then only you can do your columns or beams and slabs. So, that logic primarily derives your schedule, and that is primarily called a logic driven. The next is resource driven. Suppose I am having 2 or more crews for doing a particular work. So, based on the resource crews, I can always do the work in parallel, or based on less number of scarce resources that I have, I may have to sequentially execute the project. Okay. For example, there are 3 activities which requires the same resource called and resource Y. Okay. So, all these 3 activities will be done one after the other if there is only one crew with me. But if I have more crews, maybe 2 crews, then 2 activities can be done simultaneously, or if I have 3 crews, then all the 3 activities can be done together. So, those are primarily the resource driven schedules. And the last is information driven schedule. We have to define many more terminology to arrive at the word called information. So, information is nothing but height of the structure or width of the beam, reinforcement spacing, cover to the reinforcement. These are all called information in a project. So, these information drive the schedules. Okay. So, primarily this is part of your design phase of the execution. I would say we have several design phase examples to cover on information driven schedule, but never assume that it cannot be applied in construction as well. If you have information driven data in construction, it can be still applied in construction phase. So, in that way the first two, logic driven, resource driven, I may be planning to share more examples from construction sector, and information driven primarily from design phase of the projects. Okay. That is how I am planning to go ahead, and these 3 schedules we will be seeing in elaborate. Okay. Now, let us come to the PMBOK time management flow diagram. So, now actually we have moved on into what is scheduling. So, as I have been telling you, scheduling is nothing but planning plus time. So, planning, there is lot of homework to be done as to what is the scope of the work, what all has to be done, what is the critical milestones in the entire project. Everything is decided in the planning stage itself, and then you add duration, sequence to the project. Sequencing you do primarily with the help of relationship between the different activities, and then you move ahead. Okay. So, if you look at the time management flow diagram, there are few steps given in the PMBOK. One is define activities. Okay. Why do we need activities and what is an activity? Definition of activity and etc. we will see in the next lecture, but since the name has come right now, I will just give a small example. An activity also has a similar setup as a project. Okay. In a very simpler layman language, if you want, I can tell. So, project and activity both have similar terminologies, in the sense both are having a definite start, definite end, both have a specific objective, both case they consume resources. Then why project? Suppose if you want to think about an auditorium project, it is very difficult for you to monitor an 6-month project in one go. So, these activities are nothing but the breakdown of the project into smaller groups, so that you are able to perceive the project, and you are also able to control, you are also able to imagine all the assumptions and then monitor the whole project. Okay. In that way we call it as activities, and hence we have excavation, foundation, then column footing. So, we have shuttering, de-shuttering, we have so many activities from that point of view. And the next is sequence. The relationship between each activities, once you determine that, then you can easily get the sequence, whether I am having all independent activities or dependent activities, what is the sequence between those activities can be really seen. Then the next is estimation. So, primarily I need to have, as I told, we are seeing on scheduling. So, it is time aspects. Okay. So, time aspects can come from two forms, either you fix the duration and decide your resources, or you decide your resources and then fix your duration. So, both has to go in parallel, that is where I have written it like this. Okay. So, one is called duration driven schedules, or it is resource driven schedules, whatever. If I have 5 crores, my schedule will be of my duration of the activity will be different. If I have to finish my activity in 10 days, then what is the crew size I have to go ahead. So, that is primarily the two differences we have, and then you develop your schedule mechanism. So, this is a broad flow diagram which we have it for time management. So, now first task, define activities. In order to arrive at a list of activities, there are some techniques available. The very famous technique in construction is your work breakdown structure. Some people say it's part of a planning process also, some people say it's a part of a scheduling process to arrive at a list of activities. So, I thought I will cover this for today, and then in the next lecture we will really see the definitions of activities, relationships, durations for each activity and so on in detail. Okay. So, work breakdown structure, the famous short form is WBS. So, what is this WBS? It is a hierarchical representation outlining the structure of work for a project. So, the smaller and smaller groups of work until the lowest manageable level, often it is called activities, that is primarily called as a work breakdown structure. In general, it is an iterative process. Why? Because as and when you start developing a WBS, the scope of the work is also determined along with the WBS generation. So, at 10% start of the project, you have very little information on the project. Then after 20% start of the project, you have some more information coming in, some more players coming in, some more scope of the work gets clarified. Then you may have more data coming in. So, then you may have to try, modify, do this and this. So, this keeps on evolving, and hence it is generally termed as iterative in nature. And WBS can be used as an instrument for scheduling, personal assignments, which implies human resource assignments, resource allocations, and measuring the project progress, etc. So, it is also used in a way for doing that. And the purpose of WBS is to demonstrate clearly to all parties involved in the project how the each task is related to the whole project in terms of budget, schedule, performance, again responsibility, who is going to execute the work, or the physical assets of the whole project. For example, I have given an example, this is one activity example. So, at the end of a WBS, somebody has to build up a chart like this, not necessarily in the same form, but these are the information which goes into that activity. Okay. Activity ID, this is primarily a housing project, and the first activity in the housing project is called line plan. So, what is that line plan all about? So, the description is line plan, assumptions made. What is the assumption? The customer is supposed to be available till the architecture drawings are finalized. That is the assumption made for the line plan execution. Time required approximately 1 week. Resources, how many people you want, one architect is enough for consultation, and even that person need not be available permanently, maybe 1 hour per day is enough, maximum of 6 hours is more than sufficient for the whole work. And the discussions can happen through telephone, email discussions and what not. So, what is the cost consumed for this activity? 2500 rupees we have to pay for the architect per day, that is the whole cost part. And who is responsible to execute this line plan? It is a project manager. So, who is in charge for executing this work? It is a project manager. So, like this we have to derive for each and every activity, that naturally comes with all the assumptions you are putting in, and you are actually deriving and decomposing your project into various levels. Now, let us see an example also. This is a simple example, and developing a construction management laboratory. Actually, this was a live example which happened in our premises, but I have modified the example just to showcase the problem as such. So, this is a room. Okay. So, the room was not functional for few years, and this was supposed to be taken up by the construction management group in setting up their laboratory. So, actually what is the initial scope of the whole work? This has to be developed for a teaching laboratory and a research laboratory. So, teaching means teaching for computational software for students, PG students, and also as a research laboratory for the PhD students and MTech students. That was the whole scope of the work. okay, and the dimensions of the project are given. So, there is a door that cannot be replaced or shifted, the door's place is fixed, dimensions of the room are given. So, with this the project started. So, now what happened? So, the critical requirements of the lab were now started shocking down. So, somebody started talking down what are all required to be done with the given scope. So, it has to be functional, the functional features of the space of the rectangle space is supposed to be serve as a computational lab function. So, that has to be set up. Okay. So, the room space, room interiors, room facilities, hardware, software, prototype models. So, an outline on 2 or 3 meetings happened and some list came from the user groups were the student groups and the faculty groups, and some list came emerged together, which I have just written down. Okay. Room space, interior space will be completely renovated because it was very old and did not have the ambience for students to sit and work and for class to be conducted. Room facility, one bookshelf was necessary and people thought there should be a bookshelf for somebody to refer books and then work on their projects and research. Projector for teaching purposes, display boards for putting notices and so on, one whiteboard, 1 or 2 AC units for the so many people and computers sitting in the room, they wanted 1 or maybe even 2 AC units, and CCTV cameras for security purposes. Hardware, so high end computational facilities maybe in the form of workstations were planned, proposed. Software, like for example, what these construction management group generally use, so MS Project, Primavera, Tilos, Formwork software. So, all these were, so the list went on, and as and how many were there, they wanted to implement that many software for installations. Then prototype models also, because it was supposed to be an construction laboratory, they also wanted working models, maybe a small backhoe or a crane setup, showcase to the students and teach in the class as well. So, the ambience also was planning for a display models. And next is occupancy status. So, seating capacity approximately with the current situation, we plan for 10 PhD students and 20 MTech students who work in the projects should be able to sit very spaciously and without less disturbances, they have to sit and work in their labs. So, this was the, so after the purpose was drafted out, room was given, after 2 or 3 meetings had happened, the first cut idea on what is the requirement for the lab emerged. Okay. Then what happened was, so this I am highlighting it because I am going to explain this in detail. So, seating capacity was 10 PhDs and 20 MTechs. Okay. Then the WBS structure started evolving. So, which should define the scope of the whole work. Okay. Keeping these client the requirements of the students and the users. So, WBS I thought I will just put it for you. So, I arranged it under 3 categories: room related, students related, faculty related. Now, WBS, as I told, it is a hierarchical tree form, okay, and how many ever levels you wanted to go, you can still go and finish. There is no harm and there is no constraints or hard and fast rule as to how many levels you have to go. Is it 3 levels or 4 levels, or what is the lowest level of the base of the WBS? There is no hard and fast rule on anything, okay, and how much ever you are comfortable in building up or in the hierarchical breakdown, you can still go ahead with that. So, I have purposely brought a non-construction example in order to showcase WBS can be done in any form. It is not necessarily that project, then system, components, sub-components, you need not go in some hierarchy, you can go in any way, but the work, the next level or your lower level of WBS should always be, when you are adding up, it should always supplement your upper level of the WBS, that you should keep in mind. Okay. For example, under the item number 1, whatever I have highlighted, it should all completely describe the item called room related. So, that you should ensure that it is happening, and you can go in any order or level you wanted. Okay. So, from that angle, so what do you want in the room related? So, room related tasks were all envisioned. So, primarily it is plaster of Paris or POP. So, the room interior was very bad. So, there should be a POP, whitewashing, painting was essential, false ceiling was required in order to avoid too much of current electricity issues. So, false ceiling was proposed, flooring also was proposed to be modified. Then AC was planned, so AC units and all those lights, fans, etc., fire protection systems, CCTV camera, biometric attendance, all these for security purposes in the whole room, because so many of inventory were coming into the room space. Okay. So, all these were proposed in the particular room. Okay. Students related items. So, seating space, first is they need a seating space, a table and a chair to sit and work. Arrangement of tables and chairs, that also was an essential criteria there. Then computer, they need computer. Accessories also they want, primarily printer, scanner, that is optional, and UPS was there. Software, there are two categories in software. One is a class oriented software or the basic software, I would say, and the research oriented software which only few students will be using in the particular lab, that was also planned for. Then storage space for books or other documents for the students to come and work, refer something, then they need not carry it all the way for their lunch and then come back, they can leave it in the same lab and then go. So, they needed a small storage space for storing their daily routine items and documents which they were working on. Network connections, electricity connections, all these were primarily students related activities. Then faculty related, because it is supposed to be a teaching environment. So, the other user who will be coming into the lab is a faculty. What are their items? So, primarily projector, because the teaching has to be done, display boards, notice boards for announcing announcements and instructions, display models also for teaching in the class, for to aid in teaching in the class, storage space for user manuals, books, etc., or records, thesis only for faculty to use and so on. So, these are the various criteria, and with this I would like to say the scope of the work has really been identified. This is a stage 2 of or level 2 of the items which were drafted. This is how the WBS starts, has to be evolved. Now, as I highlighted in the previous place on the seating space, tables and chairs, now I will also highlight to show little more details. Okay. So, earlier I highlighted on 10 students, PhD students, and 20 MTech students also will be sitting in the lab or using the lab. The seating space, primarily the arrangement matters as to how should the table size be, chair positions, so that you can give accommodation to all these people. Okay. So, the initial proposed layout came out like this, because research scholars they wanted a privacy from others, in the sense whatever they wanted to work, they wanted a separate place for computer, and they wanted a separate place for working and on their notebooks and documents and so on. So, we formed like it little like a Y shaped and structure, or it's like a 3 cubicle structure. So, that one part you can work on your computer and the other part you can sit and work on your documents. So, there was planned, and hardly 11 people were allowed to be can be positioned with lot of space, movement in and around the scholars. So, what happened, it did function as a research laboratory. For a teaching laboratory, it was not, we were not able to accommodate more. Okay. So, the next level of arrangement was planned. So, we planned like regular pattern of a classroom structure. So, there were like 6 tables, because more tables could not be accommodated in. So, we proposed 6 tables and there were shutters. So, these were the layout, general layout arrangement. Bookshelves on the last side of the structure. So, this door cannot be modified, and the room dimensions are given here. The display boards, we thought we will just hang it up all along the whole walls. Display boards were planned, and there were bookshelves on the back side of the whole lab. Okay. In the front side, there was a projector screen planned. The display models were kept on one side of the whole setup. So, all provisions that we thought of keeping in the lab were all had come in, and this was planned as a 2-seater or maximum a 4-seater when the class is going on. So, in that way, so if research scholars, it was planned as 2. So, this was ideally like 12 people were sitting, 6 tables, 12 people were sitting. Okay, for the research purpose, and when the teaching was going on, this was planned to be accommodated with 2 seats per computer, and hence it was also functioning as a teaching laboratory. Okay. So, this is the next level of detailed plans working out, and then the schedule starts coming in, okay, as to how should the table size be, how should the chairs be, should we buy stools or chairs. So, all those details will go on when once you start executing the project in the next levels and so on. Okay. I thought I will just show you on this. Now, more pictures on this. Okay. So, this was an rough cut draft. Okay. So, primarily my projector screen is lying here, display models were planned to be here, and the door is supposed to open on this side for the people to enter and go, so on. So, actually one seat for the research people to sit, and when the classes were going on, 2 people were supposed to sit in all these places. So, per table, and one computer they were shared, so that more than 20 people could be seated, had a sitting arrangements. Okay. And the problem with the earlier setup was, in this setup, even if we had a projector on one side, all students were not be able to be facing the course instructor, and they were not be able to work simultaneously, but as in this model they could do. So, it was even the layout and arrangement were all fine. Okay. So, these iterations also happen sometimes, maybe the example is not that explicitly explaining to you what I wanted to say, but still I would like to say, starting from purpose to serve as teaching and research laboratory, okay, with the funds, time constraints and all those. So, the primarily the idea has to evolve. Okay. So, this was the earlier meeting, then this was the next meeting, and then just for one item sitting arrangements 2-3 iterations also happen. So, this is how the entire WBS process goes on. I just wanted to showcase with this example. This is another view of the same build structure. Now, coming back to the table chair arrangement alone. Okay. So, the computer was planned on the table, network electricity points were through the walls, were planned through the walls and to the seats, and it used to come below this, and then for this table also. Printers cum scanner was planned to be here, UPS there was a small provision for putting in the UPS, storage space. So, all students related activities all has been accustomed here. Okay. This I would say the WBS was able to capture the complete scope of the project. Some cases it does not do, okay, because of the budget, other constraints. Some cases you may have to modify also, but in this case it was able to capture the complete requirements of the students related. Okay. So, just wrapping up for today's lecture, we started on introducing what is a project, project management, definitions on the project and management, etc., and then we moved on into planning, scheduling and control. We have seen all the 3 little in detail. Scheduling we have seen in much more in depth, and as to the benefits of scheduling, then types of schedules, okay, and what is the various ways of doing the scheduling, for example, logic driven, resource driven and information driven scheduling, and then what is the sequence of doing a scheduling activity as such. So, first is defining activities. So, WBS is a very famous step with which you can define the list of activities without omitting or without missing any information. You can derive the complete list and using WBS, and also WBS serves as a document for scope definition. Okay. It also tells you what is the scope of your entire work. Okay. That I showed with iterations how the WBS can be evolved, okay, with the same example on developing a computational laboratory. The same example I will use in the next lecture also to show, I would say, hierarchical breakdown has moved on into list of activities, relationships, duration among the activities, scope modifications, how it got incorporated, and constraints that faced in the projects. So, let us see little more in the next class along with defining the activities, relationships and so on. So, the next lecture is also supposed to be an introductory lecture on inputs to scheduling only before we start the real networking diagram. Okay. Yes, thank you.